Absolutely. Appreciate you, man. Phenomenal job, by the way, on the previous presentation. A lot of what we do is building relationships, working together, and then actually that's part of the piece of the solution to the problem of what we're going to discuss a little bit towards the end of the presentation. So um, as far as personal experiences, I never experienced as far as a diagnosed concussion, but playing, there's probably a few that maybe potentially before we had done a lot of better job of diagnosing and caring for management of concussions, uh, maybe experience some concussions of my own. So as we go and continue forward with the presentation, so the problem before we start addressing the solution at hand or what the presentation and my research entails. So the specific sites of the brain actually controls part of how glucose is sensed, and also how it's regulated within the metabolism. So the metabolism of glucose generates ATP. Um, and then as we go into basically that axonal injury and synaptoplasticity, that decreases the brain's ability to manage that glucose. There's some things in there what we see as far as symptomology wise that we need to also address as performance and sports nutritionists, dietitians, as far as that loss of appetite, if you will. So for some terminology, axonal injury is going to be basically those long connecting fibers within the brain that is actually sheared or slightly tears due to a rapid acceleration or deceleration within the skull. And then that synaptoplasticity actually controls the communication aspect of it. So as we go forward, that neurological damage and concussion creates that transient hypermetabolic state, which is going to encompass what hyperglycemia, protein, catabolism, and also an increased energy demand, followed by hypometabolic state as well. So the area of interest as far as with my research actually was looking at the energy crisis, which can last anywhere from 30 minutes to 6 hours as far as what was seen within the rodent models. But as we continue to go forward within our concussion research, actually within humans or athletes, if you will, is seen as can last anywhere between a week and then some. So the energy crisis is that hyperglycolytic state, high energy breakdown that actually leads to a reduced cerebral blood flow, an impairment of metabolism, and then also will show some type of prolonged physiological symptoms that occurs. And then you will have a vulnerability to repeated injury due to that state as well. There's also an impairment of spatial learning and neurotransmission. So this can last anywhere up to as far as that impaired metabolism, 7 to 10 days, where the mitochondria ability to function is reduced due to that energy being spent. And Dr. Tiffany Greco, she did a great job on an analogy, basically stating that if you get mugged, fight, and you're able to run away, you're unlikely to be successful at running away again if you immediately get mugged right after. So because your energy is spent from the first mugging. So, and I apologize if I butchered that, but that's part of what we see as far as that risk of repeated injury, and then also the inability to have that successful energy breakdown to properly recover right then and there. So it takes time and progression, especially throughout the graduation protocol, in order for that to take place in recovery. So there was a study in Harmon 2013 that those who experience a concussion are 2 to 5.8 times at higher risk of experiencing another one, and also heightened symptoms and a subsequent injury as well. And that's within the first 10 days post-injury too. And that presents the highest risk of repeated injury. So this tells you that this is very important on how we can adequately manage and support that. So as we dive a little bit more into the literature as well, what we see and how nutrition can support and overall what a concussion is, this is what I like to see and speak on as far as the injury insult onion, which was from Dr. Lewis in 2016 as well, and also from Giza Havda. So the overall metabolic cascade of events where the traumatic brain injury is caused is a transfer of mechanical injury to the brain tissue. So in a recent study from Kara this year, actually in the Clinical Journal of Sports Medicine, it was a 2-year prospective observational cohort study done in New Zealand in a community-based sports concussion clinic. So 45% of participants showed clinical recovery within 14 days of injury, only 77% by 4 weeks after injury, and 96% by 8 weeks after injury. So this injury insult onion actually shows what is done and also secondary injuries that occur from seconds to minutes to hours and also days and weeks as well. And then those common complications that are going to be established as far as following a concussion is acute impairment, resulting in signs and symptoms, functional disturbances, graded clinical symptoms that we see, and also common complications that lead to ionic and neurotransmitter perturbations. So when we break down those symptoms as well, a little bit further in detail, you have your acute phases and your delayed phases. So those complications that contribute to the physical signs of symptoms, such as nausea, fatigue, irritability, loss of memory, loss of appetite, headaches, and balance changes, those can occur within the acute stage. Physiological symptoms have shown to commonly subside within 2 to 14 days. And then also those long-term complications actually can occur past that 2 to 14-day mark, if you will, which is a long range. But this is where we have to also be mindful of too. So those long-term complications is prolonged fatigue, poor concentration, behavior changes, and sleep pattern changes as well, this is where we also have to be mindful that, okay, all these symptoms may have an effect in a situation that we have a barrier of that challenges that dietary intake of that individual. So as we dive deeper into the metabolic cascade of events, so that sports-related concussion that you're seeing is going to decrease the availability of those reducing equivalents produced by the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle, and the electron transport chain. So this increases the production of oxygen and intracellular calcium within the brain as well, and also those cells. That metabolic shift is going to create that energy crisis and causing that increased demand for energy than what is actually available. So within the acute phase of energy, which is going to occur a little bit after, before an hour, a large release of glutamate from presynaptic terminals actually disrupt the ionic equilibrium on postsynaptic membranes. And this contributes to the hypermetabolic and catabolic state observed. So points to highlight within here is going to be a blood-brain barrier that being weakened, potassium, chloride, sodium, that's going to leak through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain as well. This is going to cause inflammation, decrease in synaptic signaling, and a potential loss of consciousness as well, with some things that we see within some type of mild to moderate traumatic brain injuries, or severe as well. You also can see oxygen deprivation that can build up lactate and cause cell death, and an inflammatory response causing proteases and cytokines to release for tissue repair. So what we don't know is where are the energy demands and how do we support this increase in metabolic demand. So the inadequate energy intake, if we look more so into, okay, now we have those hormones that control basically those signals of appetite stimulation and suppression. So if you look in leptin, that controls the individual's sense of satiety and sends signals to decrease food intake. Leptin receptors are found in several brain areas, actually in the hypothalamus, the cerebral cortex, and the hippocampus. And this can reveal how that hormone may mediate energy homeostasis as well. So ghrelin is an appetite that stimulates a release of basically on an empty stomach and also stimulates the appetite as well. So when that neuronal damage occurs within that concussion, these hormones may not only be affected, but actually be the potential cause of why an individual may experience loss of appetite and complicate that ability to consume enough energy for the brain to even adequately recover. So these are the 4 areas as well within those nutrition-related symptoms of concussions. So energy homeostasis, glucose metabolism, and regulation of appetite is controlled by those neuronal connections that affect eating behaviors and regulate metabolic pathways. Experiencing these symptoms actually contributes to the symptom severity score, which is in the category of visual, olfactory, and gustatory stimuli. These can stimulate exocrine and endocrine secretions that impact that desire to eat, as previously described. So within, backdated from 1940, in a review of rodent models, mechanical damage of ventral medial nucleus within the hypothalamus was actually shown to influence appetite hormones and eating behaviors. Since then, there hasn't been as far as too much of pinpointing exactly how that occurs and what occurs from that, but that's something I'll also bring up, and I'll be happy to share any reference articles or citations as well. So, and I want to keep emphasizing that the regions critical for appetite regulation include the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, the prefrontal cerebral cortex, and the amygdala as well. So within concussions, all these areas being affected can actually be an underlying situation of why appetite is actually suppressed. So now, how has nutrition supported concussion recovery? So to look a little bit more so with more research coming about as far as the gut microbiome and the regulator of the immune system. So there's inflammatory changes that occur after brain trauma that occurs immediately. And this figure would illustrate how cortical injury can lead to those inflammatory consequences. And Dr. Jonathan Chung did a great job, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering anybody's name, of emphasizing and also describing these things in a blog post as well, as far as how TBI can result in poor motility of the gut. So within animal models, there have been shown to have the injury to lead to more porous gut permeability within the 3 hours of TBI. TBI disrupts the blood-brain barrier, leads to priming of microglia and neural inflammation. Structural signs of the brain injury are correlated to the amount of microglia primed in the brain. And then also that disrupted gut lining after TBI is actually susceptible to rogue bacteria, if you will, entering the bloodstream, causing systemic inflammation. So that systemic inflammation can further impact the brain's microglia and also increase further neural inflammation long after TBI, which actually from my 2017 showing that her data indicated that moderate TBI induces morphological abnormalities within the colon at 28 days after injury. So another thing to also look into is possibly even how creatine can be beneficial. So Dr. Darren Kandow and Laurent Bannock did a great job on the episode as far as an Institute of Performance Nutrition podcast. And then also this is showing that how, first, before we go into what the supplementation aspect of it has shown, understanding a little bit of the metabolism within creatine, especially in relation to the brain, if you will. So creatine synthesis and uptake is actually different in subpopulations of cells within the brain. This is basically just showing that there are different stages and different situations of how that metabolism will take place within neuronal and astrocytic and within those subpopulations that contain both enzymes of creatine synthesis pathway of AGAT and GAMT in part 1, where part 2, it may only possess one or the other of AGAT or GAMT. And then in part 3, it may possess none of those synthetic enzymes at all whatsoever and actually be relying on SLC6A8 to take up creatine produced by other cells. So within creatine, actually 95% is stored within the muscle if we go back, and then less than 5% is stored actually within the brain. And there has been a few studies that involve brain levels of neurological creatine storage and function, but it's still within its infancy. So findings in experimental research of human subjects of brain creatine and TBI, although it's limited, it can reveal that supplementation may improve cognition, communication, behavior, reduce headaches, dizziness, fatigue in children in pediatric settings and clinical settings of those with TBI. So in theory, due to the brain requiring a constant supply of energy, supplementing creatine may be actually an alternate substrate by increasing brain levels, by improving brain energy metabolism as well. So these are a lot of those other different nutrients that have came about as far as what helps with the concussion management and recovery process within rodent models. Zinc has been one that has actually been seen more so within within our human population. And then as far as like with vitamin D, it can help modulate the inflammatory response. Same thing with vitamin E as well, improve cognition following repetitive concussive brain injury has been shown in mice. Reduce oxidative stress and improving learning and memory. Niacin has actually hopefully been shown to improve recovery in rodents following TBI. And then zinc can help reduce oxidative stress, inflammation, apoptosis, and autophagy. And then magnesium has been shown to help with increasing brain bioavailability in humans and curcumin, and also normalizing brain-derived neutrophilic factor levels and improve motor and learning performance in animals exposed to TBI, where resveratrol reduce reactive oxygen species, suppress excitotoxicity, and reduce inflammation and control cortical impact of TBI. So from all this food that we consume, obviously we consume food and not nutrients, which has been heavily stated and also a great thing to be stated. We have to be mindful that, okay, when we encompass basically those performance plates, let's have that balance and variety of those things in there to meet those needs to help maybe encompass all of these nutrients in there. So now as we go into a little bit more of the whole macronutrient process, if you will, we gotta state that glucose is the primary fuel source of the brain. So there's actually glycogen storage that is observed within the brain as well, predominantly seen within astrocytes within the brain. So the glycogen reserve within those astrocytes are primarily utilized for functions such as synaptic activity, memory formation, and this is during increased metabolic demands as well. So if you will, the energy crisis. So the glycogen that is available within muscle allows for glycogenolysis so that the athlete has sufficient energy to utilize during training and competition. This may aid in overall health and recovery of the athlete and may prevent further injury and muscle degradation too. So the brain utilizes an abundant amount of calories and glucose in relation to the rest of the body in order to transfer energy into neurons to properly function. So the metabolism of glucose that generates ATP provides energy for the brain to maintain cell maintenance and neurotransmission. So specialized neurons in the hypothalamus will include POMC and AGRP, and sense central and peripheral glucose levels and regulate glucose metabolism. And I actually put the referencing articles here so that way you can further go and deep dive into what these things will state and also the metabolic processes as well. So within after that first part of A, now as we move on to B, glucose supply in the brain is actually regulated and coupled and modulated by metabolism-dependent and independent mechanisms. So glucose enters the brain from the blood-brain barrier through glucose transporter 1, or GLUT1. So glucose and other metabolites such as lactate are rapidly distributed through a highly coupled metabolic network of brain cells. Glucose provides the energy for neurotransmission, and several glucose metabolizing enzymes control cellular survival. So as we go into the final step, so disturbed glucose metabolism on any of these levels within here of what you see can be the foundation for the development of large variety of disorders of the brain. And also this could be relatable to what we see as far as in TBI. So the thing about protein, there has not been much evidence. There's some coming out as far as the branched amino acids. That's fairly recent and it's very limited. So there's only 2 that I've seen as far as so far. And then if anybody has more to share, please feel free to do so. That there's an emphasis of greater than or equal to 2 weeks, that 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day actually needs to be emphasized. And within those animal models, pathogenic processes related to the secondary phase of recovery to help with the neuroinflammation, increased excitatory amino acids and free radicals and neuronal damage is emphasized within that protein intake too. So the one that controls and actually has a more substantial amount of evidence is going to be those omega-3 fatty acids, which composes of your DHA, EPA, and ALA, where there was a recent study that 34% of collegiate athletes, that study was done here in the States, are at high risk of sport concussions due to low dietary intake. This will actually promote synapse formation and glutamate receptor expression. And then also that the dietary supplementation of omega-3 fatty acids, this can reduce oxidative stress developing brain due to TBI, and then also help with the plasticity of neurons, impaired learning, and also help with preventing cell death, if you will. So to go into a little bit more of what my research entailed and what we did there at the University of Mississippi, and it wouldn't have not been able to be possible without the relationships and also the communication of the great staff within the health and sports performance team there. This is why when Charles stated that the relationships is basically a foundation also, and also the success of not just the performance of the athlete, but even in nutrition and injury management and protocols as well, is very valuable, not just within the sports performance support staff, but also with those coaches and alongside with those athletes and building those relationships too. So we actually utilized the measures that was done was using a SCAT-5, which is a self-reported self-evaluation form, dietary record we collected by meeting with the student athletes on campus at the dining facility daily during main meal times, such as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or we met with the participants during daily injury and symptomology assessment too with the team athletic trainer. So we also utilize mobile phone imaging to help support what we're recording and analyzing, because obviously if there is a brain trauma and brain impact, they probably can't recall as successfully what they consumed the day before or even the day of. So we used that mobile phone imaging if it was cleared by the medical director for them to use that with a blue light filter on there, to take pictures of that, or have an assigned roommate or an assigned guardian or teammate to actually take those pictures for us. So this is where communication was very, very overly done and key. And then also we analyzed that calorie and nutrient intake by the nutrition data system for research. So, and that was utilizing basically the Nelson equation. We probably used too high of an activity factor, but at that time frame, it was we used an activity factor 2.07 to represent a very active population, where there's now current and also developing research that may be actually too high of something to consider of what the actual needs are of that individual, if we're trying to quantify how much we need to support with that. So within our procedures, there was actually pre-participation consent forms done, IRB protocols and processes was done, within the physical screenings, the preseason, and also during team meetings as well during that time frame. So before any of that has been established, we actually divided within the group assignment was one of every two athletes with a concussion or suspicion of a concussion was assigned to the intervention group. So, and the others were assigned to the control group. So if the opportunity was missed to actually get the supplement within that intervention protocol that I have established there in the middle, then they were automatically done within the control group. So the intervention group was actually given a carbohydrate supplement. There was 2 servings at immediate impact, suspicion of concussion, or within 30, 60 minutes of diagnosis, 1 serving every other hour within the first 4 hours of the day of diagnosis, and then 1 serving 2 times per day until the athlete returns to baseline. And that was basically done due to, in theory, possibly even the animal models that show most of the substantial research of that 30 minutes to 4 to 6 hour mark done there. And then just to give them a little bit of something in there if they are having that effect of a lack of dietary intake or lack of appetite because of that, getting some form of type of carbohydrates, if you will, there. And there's a lot of nutrition that's also being established of alternate substrate with BHB and ketone esters and things like that, as far as it's being established there, and also creatine as well. But the thing is that, okay, we're trying to just help with support of this overall intake maybe. So daily dietary intake using of 1 of 3 methods was done. So we assigned a roommate, as I stated previously in the previous slide, met with the student athlete on campus during a dining facility during their main meal times, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then also we possibly even brought the prepared meals to the athlete to assess dietary intake after each box lunch is consumed. So again, we analyzed those findings using the NSDR, NDSR, sorry about that, and compared the intervention group and the control group regarding the return to baseline, symptom severity, and dietary intake. So the first part of what was established, and I'll briefly go through this. So since now that I'm getting ready to get off of my hiatus and break, being done from my PhD studies and successfully defending my dissertation, if you will, a few weeks ago, and spending time with my family, the first thing was done was that positive energy balance significantly contributed to actually recovery from concussion in collegiate athletes. And given the sample size that we had 40 actually of those participants, there was a statistical significance as far as that was shown of those who actually met their overall average calories and an acceleration of basically and supporting the recovery phases as well. So, and there wasn't any interaction at all as far as in between the intervention that we established. So the intervention that was thought to have that support and help did not have the actual situation that in theory that I thought was going to take place. And then it also about an average of a change of like around 5 days, actually, if those individuals that met their calories and met their needs actually had an accelerated rate of recovery within a 5-day mark. The other thing was actually showing that high carbohydrate intake actually resulted in shorter recovery time too from concussions in collegiate athletes. Now, this could where you can argue, okay, is that even potentially due to the fact of what our actual dietary intake is here in the States, more so as far as carb heavy, or even just the performance of the athlete as well and their needs and what's communicated with that for them to consume mostly. So it showed that carbohydrate intake, and if you will, if you've seen that, had a more of a relationship with the predicting of number of days until being asymptomatic. And that was what we quantified and classified um, as being recovered, if you will. And this was prior to doing the impact test to actually show clinical definition or anything like that as far as with recovery in that sense. So carbohydrate had that predictor of number of days, where fat and protein did not. And then there is things that we can discuss as far as with that at the end of that, that meeting overall energy needs may shorten the length of time symptoms are present post-concussion. The experimental group, again, did not reveal a significant effect on symptom duration, but this small difference may actually support nutrition intervention development and implementation in concussion injury protocol. Reported symptom evaluations may also contain outdated or inaccurate measurements toward full clinical recovery, especially if baseline measurements are not reassessed annually. So this is where it's very important to have multiple assessments if you have that ability to do so. And then while symptoms are subjective measurement, reflecting various phases in the metabolic cascade of events, it's important to consider actually the relationship and role energy intake has on recovery and neurological and physiological trauma. So healthcare practitioners actually in sport consider symptoms to make objective return to play decisions for the athlete to successfully navigate through return to play graduation protocols to return to sport with full participation clearance. So there are also other variables that we have to consider that wasn't measured within the study to affect the recovery time. So things such as sleep decline, dehydration, gender differences, injury severity, and also pre-existing neurodevelopmental disorders and health complications such as ADHD, learning disabilities, substance abuse, or anything like that, history of headaches and migraines. And I have those studies as well, collectively collected, to kind of differentiate and show kind of other variables that may have an effect with that. So there was also, now that they were seeing that an increased intake of carbohydrates potentially affects the time frame of symptoms when diagnosed with a concussion. And as we go further and forward, so this is where we try to say, okay, how can we help and guide the athlete to recovery in our aspect of the job? So we want to guide the athlete to actually eat, because if the thing as far as to address is the lack of appetite, we have to see, okay, this is where relationships are very important, because we have to communicate with the athlete, understand our athlete, and see, okay, what is their typical intake? It may not be ideal at all whatsoever as far as what they typically consume. And one thing I did not do was put the pictures up of what the intakes were of those athletes. But as you may know, typically seen within what we're talking about as far as with our Western diet as well too, needs to be changes with that, but there's some things as well that if there's a lack of appetite, that having that energy and also during the time frame of that energy as well can actually help with concussion recovery as much as possible, to help meet those energy demands and needs to help support that recovery process. So we want to help as much as possible, communicate and guide through basically that performance plate, if you will. Now, I know this says easy training and weight management, and they did a great job as doing this, but this can be something as far as now we've seen that, okay, with that previous research, there has been a variety of nutrients that have shown feedback and have shown support that in rodent models. Okay, what if we do as best as possible, since there are various foods that have an importance and have different categories of different nutrients and vitamins as well, having that, implementing that, putting that in front of them as much as possible and have them eat that so we can address that and get that in there as much as possible. We want to adjust the interventions that we also display within that after the basics are even covered. So just continuously be hands-on as much as possible. Obviously, there's many of us that have way more than just that team of the athletes as well, depending on how many sports nutritionists, dietitians you have on staff, especially if you're in a collegiate setting. You can have anywhere between, just yourself will have anywhere between 100 to 650 by yourself, depending on the people that you have in place and the support that you have as well. So this is where that relationship is very important to address with the overall interdisciplinary team that you have with you. So you also want to supplement and around the dietary intake. So, and the personal opinion, there's still developing research as far as supplementation, but in a sense too, we have to, this is where the communication is, and you at your discretion and professional opinion, address and help with the supplementation of that athlete to help maybe support that concussion recovery at whatever your budget entails to that, if you can. So, but again, such as Charles stated, you have to communicate, and also don't just establish and do things just to do them. Be mindful of what you're establishing and making sure things are third party tested, and as far as we go with that. So this is where if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Obviously, plan on paper doesn't always work, but you also want to establish a plan and make sure that you are communicating, build a relationship with those sport coaches, the support staff, sports medicine, athletic training, strength and conditioning, to see, okay, how can we help in case you are not there at that current time? So everybody is on the same page on how to successfully manage and help with whatever injury protocol that we have to take place within that. So this is where you have to have a coordination of care, communication, education, nutrition assessment intervention, supplement intervention, and also behavior modification as well. So having that plan and discussing and making sure that we're all on the same page. And then if you have that luxury of having a mental health sports performance team, making sure that they're on the same page and address as well, because there's been a lot of times that we handle in our perspective setting without communicating with everyone as far as, okay, the situation, or even getting their assistant with that too, and how we can support that. So you also want to have a creativity and individualized approach in the nutrition intervention and supplement implementation too, when we are communicating and when we are supporting these concussions. So if there's any questions and things to go further in detail, I'll try to be mindful of the audience that we have and the variety of audience that we have as well. So, and if we want to go further in things, please feel free to contact me. There's my Twitter handle and also my Instagram as well. I'm more so on Twitter than anything, or you can email me. You have my work and personal email as well too.